My grandparents skipped my veterinary school graduation, calling it a pointless waste of time. They literally told me I was an embarrassment to our family legacy. But days later, an agricultural biotech company, valued at $8 billion, saw my worth and hired me on the spot with a $6.7 million acquisition package. Suddenly, my grandmother called, demanding a family meeting to discuss my so-called debts. I showed up all right, but with a surprise they never saw coming. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I stood in the arched doorway of my grandparents' lavish Atlanta estate, gripping my hard-earned diploma tube in my sweaty hands. The heavy scent of Sunday dinner filled the air. Candied yams, collard greens, and smothered chicken created a feast I had missed out on all day because I was walking across a stage to receive my doctorate in veterinary medicine completely alone. I looked at the crystal chandelier hanging over the massive mahogany dining table. Every single chair was filled. My grandfather Winston sat at the head, carving a roast with meticulous precision. Beside him, my grandmother Josephine adjusted her pearls, ignoring my presence entirely. My sister Jasmine, the golden child cosmetic dermatologist, laughed at something her husband Spencer whispered in her ear. Spencer, a white corporate lawyer with a penchant for expensive suits and subtle condescension, swirled his wineglass. My own parents, David and Yolanda, sat further down, quietly eating the food paid for by my grandparents' real estate empire. Not a single person looked up to say congratulations. I cleared my throat, tapping the cardboard tube against my leg. I graduated, I said, my voice steady despite the knot forming in my chest. Winston did not even pause his carving knife. Josephine sighed as if my voice had personally offended her. Spencer was the first to acknowledge me. He wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and reached into his tailored jacket, pulling out a thick manila envelope. He slid it across the polished wood of the table until it stopped right in front of my empty place setting. Josephine asked me to draft this, Spencer said, leaning back with a smug smile. Go ahead and open it, Imani. Consider it a graduation present from the family trust. I set my diploma tube down and picked up the envelope. Inside was a stack of legal documents topped with an itemized bill. The bold print at the bottom read, $114,000. I stared at the number, my mind struggling to process the sheer audacity of the demand. What is this? I asked, looking directly at my grandmother. Spencer answered for her, his tone dripping with the kind of polite arrogance he perfected in the courtroom. It is the cost of the family's investment in your life, Imani. Since popping dog pimples does not exactly yield a high return on investment, they have decided to cut their losses. You see, your grandfather paid for your braces in middle school, your car insurance during your undergraduate years, and the occasional grocery run when you were too busy studying farm animals to work a real job. We calculated the principal plus a very generous low-interest rate. I looked at my parents, expecting them to defend me. They were the ones who were supposed to pay for those things, but they had always lived entirely dependent on Winston's payroll. My mother, Yolanda, suddenly found her green beans fascinating, refusing to meet my eyes. Do not look at me, Imani, Yolanda hissed, keeping her voice low so she would not disturb Winston's dinner. You brought this on yourself. We told you to go to law school like Spencer. We told you that working with animals was beneath a family of our stature. Jasmine saves human lives. She deserves the resources. You are an embarrassment to Black excellence. You just want to play in the dirt. I pulled my bag tighter against my side, feeling the ultimate betrayal. My father David finally spoke up, checking his gold watch. Just give them the keys, Imani. Do not make a scene. Spencer is right. You owe the family, and since you cannot pay, you have to surrender your assets. Hand over the keys to your car. Jasmine needs a second vehicle for her new clinic. You can take the bus from now on. I looked at Jasmine, who was admiring her fresh manicure. You want my car? I asked, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. Jasmine, you wrecked 3 luxury cars before you even finished your residency, and Grandpa bought you a brand new Mercedes each time. Jasmine flipped her long hair over her shoulder. Do not compare us, Imani. I elevate the family name. You went to school to squeeze anal glands and deliver calves. You are a terrible investment. Spencer chuckled, swirling his wine again. Jasmine is right. You need to be realistic about your place in this family. Now toss your car keys on the table before your grandfather loses his temper. You know how he feels about your attitude. I stared at the white man sitting at my black grandfather's table, ordering me to surrender the car I bought with my own savings from working double shifts at the animal clinic. I looked at Winston, the patriarch, who supposedly built this family on the values of hard work. Grandpa, I said, my voice dangerously quiet. You are going to let him sit here and talk to me like this. You are going to let him demand my car. Winston finally set down his carving knife. He wiped his hands deliberately and fixed me with a cold, calculating stare. You chose to humiliate this family by pursuing a useless degree, he said. Spencer is managing the family assets now, and he is doing exactly what I asked him to do. Give your sister the keys, Amani, or face the consequences. I looked around the room. I saw the greed in Jasmine's eyes, the smug satisfaction on Spencer's face, the cowardly silence of my parents, and the absolute disdain for my grandparents. For 29 years, I had broken my back trying to earn a seat at this table. I had endured the mockery, the constant comparisons to Jasmine, the subtle jabs about my chosen profession. I reached into my purse and pulled out my key ring. The metal jingled loudly in the quiet dining room. Jasmine's eyes lit up with triumph, and she extended her manicured hand across the table, waiting to receive her prize. I looked at the keys, then looked at Spencer's pristine white dress shirt and his expensive red wine. With a flick of my wrist, I tossed the heavy ring of keys directly into his wine glass. The crystal shattered instantly, sending dark red liquid splashing all over his custom-tailored suit and onto Jasmine's expensive dress. Spencer jumped up, cursing loudly, while Jasmine shrieked, dabbing frantically at her ruined outfit. Have the car, I said, picking up my diploma tube. The transmission is slipping, and the AC has been broken for 2 years. Good luck running your errands in the Georgia heat, Jasmine. Winston slammed his fists onto the mahogany table, making the silver plates rattle violently. How dare you! He roared, his face turning purple with rage. You insolent, ungrateful little girl. You think you can walk into my house and disrespect us. I am not a little girl, Grandpa. I am a doctor, I shot back, my voice ringing clear and authoritative over his shouting. You are a failure, Winston spat. And since you want to act so independent, you have exactly 24 hours to pack your trash and get out of the apartment. That property belongs to my company. You are evicted. Do not let me catch you on my property by tomorrow morning, or I will have Spencer call the police and have you arrested for trespassing. I did not say another word. I turned my back on the lavish dining room, the shattered crystal, and the people who shared my blood, but never my heart. I walked down the long hallway and out the heavy oak front doors, stepping into the warm Atlanta evening. The rain had just started to fall, mixing with the tears I refused to shed inside. I stood under the bus shelter, shivering in my graduation dress, wondering how I was going to pack my entire life into boxes by sunrise. Then my phone buzzed in my purse. I pulled it out, expecting an angry text from my mother. Instead, the screen illuminated with an email notification from the CEO of Apex Biosolutions, the largest agricultural biotech firm in North America. I wiped the raindrops from my screen and opened the message. Dr. Washington. The email read, the federal administration has just fast-tracked your genetic livestock vaccine. We are executing the buyout clause for your patent immediately. Attached is your official contract, including your $6.7 million sign on an acquisition package. We need you at our Chicago headquarters tomorrow morning to finalize the transfer of the $8 billion intellectual property rights. A car will be waiting for you at the airport. I read the words 3 times, my breath catching in my throat. I looked back up the hill toward my grandparents' glowing mansion, where they were probably still complaining about my useless degree. They had just kicked me out into the street to protect their wealth. They had absolutely no idea that I had just become the richest person in the family. I looked across the mahogany table at my parents. David and Yolanda sat there with their heads bowed over their plates of collard greens and candied yams. I needed them to say something. I needed my father to stand up and tell Spencer he had no right to hand me a fake bill for my own childhood expenses. I needed my mother to remind her parents that I had just spent 8 years in school earning my doctorate. Instead of speaking up for me, my mother set her fork down very carefully. She wiped her mouth and stood up from her chair. She walked around the large table until she was standing right beside me. For a split second, I thought she was going to hug me or defend me. Then I felt her hand slide roughly against my side. She was reaching straight into my leather purse, trying to grab my car keys. I snatched my bag away, pulling it tightly to my chest. I asked her what she was doing. "Do not embarrass us, Imani," she hissed, her voice a harsh whisper meant to keep the peace at my grandparents' table. "Give Spencer the keys right now. You know you owe your grandfather for everything he has done for you. We told you to go to law school like Spencer. We told you that working with animals was beneath a family of our stature. Jasmine saves human lives as a surgeon. She deserves the resources. You are an embarrassment to Black excellence. You just want to play in the dirt with livestock." I stared at her. My own mother was trying to strong-arm me for a 10-year-old Honda Civic just so she could stay in her parents' good graces. My father, David, did not even look up. He just checked his gold watch and took another bite of cornbread. "Just give them the keys, Imani," my father muttered to his plate. "Do not make a scene. Spencer is right. You owe the family, and since you cannot pay, you have to surrender your assets. Hand over the keys to your car. Jasmine needs a second vehicle to commute to her new clinic. You can take the bus from now on." I looked at Jasmine. My older sister, the golden child, sat there admiring her fresh manicure. A custom diamond ring gleamed on her finger, paid for by the family trust. I asked if she really wanted my car, my voice trembling with a rage I had suppressed for nearly 30 years. I reminded Jasmine that she wrecked 3 luxury cars before she even finished her medical residency, and Grandpa bought her a brand new Mercedes each time. I pointed out she did not even know how to drive a manual transmission. Jasmine flipped her long hair over her shoulder and offered a sickly, sweet smile. "Do not compare us, Imani. I elevate the family name. You went to school to squeeze anal glands and deliver calves. You are a terrible investment. Let the vet walk home. Maybe she can ride a horse." Spencer chuckled loudly, swirling the expensive red wine in his crystal glass. "Jasmine is right," he said, leaning back in his chair with an arrogant smirk. "You need to be realistic about your place in this family. Now toss your car keys on the table before your grandfather loses his temper. You know how he feels about your attitude." He emphasized the word attitude deliberately. It was the same subtle condescension he always used around me, a microaggression wrapped in a polite tone from a white man sitting at my Black grandfather's table. He felt entirely comfortable ordering me to surrender the car I bought with my own savings from working double shifts at the animal clinic. I looked at Winston, the patriarch who supposedly built this family on the values of hard work and resilience. I kept my voice dangerously quiet and asked Grandpa if he was going to let this man sit here and demand my property. Winston finally set down his carving knife. He wiped his hands and fixed me with a cold, calculating stare. "You chose to humiliate this family by pursuing a useless degree," he said. "Spencer is managing the family assets now, and he is doing exactly what I asked him to do. Give your sister the keys, Imani, or face the consequences." I looked around the room. I saw the greed in Jasmine's eyes, the smug satisfaction on Spencer's face, the cowardly silence of my parents, and the absolute disdain from my grandparents. For my entire life, I had broken my back trying to earn a seat at this table. I had endured the mockery, the constant comparisons to Jasmine, the subtle jabs about my chosen profession in agricultural biotechnology. I reached into my purse and pulled out my keyring. The metal jingled loudly in the quiet dining room. Jasmine's eyes lit up with triumph, and she extended her manicured hand across the table, waiting to receive her prize. I looked at the keys, then looked at Spencer's pristine white dress shirt and his expensive glass of red wine. With a flick of my wrist, I tossed the heavy ring of keys directly into his wine glass. The crystal shattered instantly, sending dark red liquid splashing all over his custom-tailored suit and onto Jasmine's expensive silk dress. Spencer jumped up cursing loudly while Jasmine shrieked, dabbing frantically at her ruined outfit. Have the car, I said, picking up my diploma tube. The transmission is slipping, and the air conditioning has been broken for 2 years. Good luck running your errands in the Georgia heat, Jasmine. Winston slammed his fists onto the mahogany table, making the silver plates rattle violently. He roared, asking how dare I disrespect them, with his face turning purple with rage. He called me an insolent, ungrateful little girl. I am not a little girl, Grandpa. I am a doctor. I shot back, my voice ringing clear and authoritative over his shouting. You are a failure, Winston spat. And since you want to act so independent, you have exactly 24 hours to pack your trash and get out of the apartment. That property belongs to my company. You are evicted. Do not let me catch you on my property by tomorrow morning, or I will have Spencer call the police and have you arrested for trespassing. I did not say another word. I turned my back on the lavish dining room, the shattered crystal, and the people who shared my blood, but never my heart. I walked down the long hallway and out the heavy oak front door, stepping into the warm Atlanta evening. The rain had just started to fall, mixing with the tears I refused to shed inside. I walked down the long driveway and stood under the bus shelter, shivering in my graduation dress, wondering how I was going to pack my entire life into boxes by sunrise. The weight of their rejection threatened to crush me completely. Then my phone buzzed in my purse. I pulled it out, expecting an angry text from my mother telling me to come back and apologize. Instead, the screen illuminated with a secure email notification from the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Biosolutions, the largest agricultural biotech firm in North America. I wiped the raindrops from my screen and opened the message. Dr. Washington. The email read, the federal administration has just fast-tracked your genetic livestock vaccine. We are executing the buyout clause for your patent immediately. Attached is your official contract, including your $6.7 million sign-on and acquisition package. We need you at our Chicago headquarters tomorrow morning to finalize the transfer of the $8 billion intellectual property rights. A car will be waiting for you at the airport. I read the words 3 times, my breath catching in my throat. I looked back up the hill toward my grandparents' glowing mansion, where they were probably still complaining about my useless degree. They had just kicked me out into the street to protect their wealth. They had absolutely no idea that I had just become the richest person in the family. I stood there in the pouring rain, letting the reality of the email wash over me. The screen of my phone was the only source of light in the dark bus shelter. $6.7 million. I read the number out loud just to make sure I was not hallucinating. After years of scraping by on instant ramen and student loans, after enduring endless insults from my family about my worthless degree, my life had completely changed in a matter of seconds. I did not even wait for the bus. I opened my rideshare app and booked a luxury black car using the very last bit of credit I had to my name. I was not going to ride the bus ever again. The black car pulled up and the driver opened the door for me. I sank into the plush leather seats and gave him the address to the modest apartment my grandfather owned, the one he had just aggressively evicted me from. When I walked through the front door, I did not feel the usual heavy burden of owing my family. I felt completely free. I did not bother packing the cheap furniture or the dishes my mother had given me. I grabbed my suitcase and packed only what mattered. My clothes, my veterinary degree, and the genetic research notes that had just made me a millionaire. I left the apartment keys right on the kitchen counter, locked the door behind me, and headed straight to the airport. By 8 in the morning, I was stepping out of a private car at O'Hare International Airport in Chicago. The Apex Biosolutions headquarters was a towering fortress of glass and steel that pierced the cloudy sky. When I walked into the massive marble lobby, the receptionist immediately escorted me to the private elevator reserved for executives. I was led to a sprawling boardroom on the top floor overlooking the entire city. Sitting around a massive mahogany table were a dozen older wealthy men in immaculate tailored suits. They looked at me as I walked in, clutching my leather portfolio. I could see the subtle judgment in their eyes. To them, I was just a 29-year-old black woman holding a veterinary degree. They thought I would be intimidated by their wealth and power, just like I was supposed to be intimidated by Spencer and my grandfather. The chief executive officer stood up and offered a polite but tight smile. He addressed me as Dr. Washington and told me they were thrilled to meet me, but needed to discuss the terms of my patent. He claimed the board had raised some concerns about my lack of corporate research experience. He said that since I developed this livestock vaccine independently, they felt the initial offer of $6.7 million was a bit too generous. He told me they were prepared to offer $3 million upfront to mitigate their risk. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I slowly opened my portfolio and slid a stack of financial and genetic data projections across the polished table. I looked directly at the chief executive officer and told him that my vaccine was not a risk. It was a complete revolution. I explained the genetic markers with absolute precision, breaking down how my formula would single-handedly eradicate a virus that currently costs the United States pork industry $2 billion every single year. I told them that $3 million was an insult for a product that would make them billions, and that my initial buyout price was no longer on the table. The boardroom went completely silent. The men exchanged shocked glances, realizing they were not dealing with a desperate student. I leaned forward and told them I wanted the full $6.7 million sign-on bonus, plus a 5% equity stake in the agricultural division. I informed them that if they did not agree, I would take my patent to their biggest competitor by noon. The chief executive officer swallowed hard. He looked at the data, then looked back at me with a newfound respect. Without another word of protest, he slid the amended contract toward me and handed me his gold pen. I signed my name on the dotted line, officially securing my fortune. The money was wired to my new private accounts instantly. As the board members stood up to shake my hand, my cell phone began to vibrate in my pocket. I excused myself and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the tiny cars navigating the Chicago streets. The caller identification said it was Jasmine, my golden child sister, who had laughed at me the night before. I swiped the screen to answer, expecting her to yell at me for ruining her dress. Instead, Jasmine's voice dripped with fake sympathy and extreme condescension. She sighed loudly into the receiver and told me that Spencer and Grandpa were completely furious with me. She said Spencer finalized my eviction notice and I would be out on the street by tonight. Then she told me she was feeling generous today. She said she had just fired the receptionist at her cosmetic dermatology clinic. She offered to let me come in and answer her phones for $14 an hour, claiming it would help me pay off my massive debt to Grandpa and keep me from being completely homeless. I stood there in a penthouse boardroom worth millions of dollars, looking out over a city that was currently paying me a fortune. I listened to my sister offer me a minimum wage job as if she were a savior handing me a lifeline. I took a slow, deep breath. I told Jasmine that I appreciated the offer, but I was currently in the process of buying my own building. I told her I really did not have the time or the desire to sweep her floors. Before she could utter a single word of confusion or outrage, I ended the call. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and turned back to face the boardroom. My family thought they had broken me, but they had only handed me the exact motivation I needed to conquer their entire world. Let Spencer and Winston think they had won. They had no idea that the hunter was about to become the hunted. The private car dropped me off at the towering glass and steel headquarters of Apex Biosolutions in downtown Chicago. The morning air was crisp and cold, a sharp contrast to the humid Atlanta night I had left behind. I was wearing the only professional suit I had managed to salvage before my grandfather locked me out of the apartment. I stepped into the private executive elevator and rode it to the top floor. The doors opened directly into a penthouse boardroom that smelled of expensive leather and old money. 12 men sat around a massive mahogany table. They were all older, wealthy, and uniformly white. They stopped talking the second I walked in. Their eyes swept over me, taking in my young face and my simple suit. I could see the immediate calculation happening behind their eyes. They did not see the brilliant geneticist who had just solved a billion-dollar agricultural crisis. They saw a 29-year-old black woman who they assumed was out of her depth and easily intimidated. The chief executive officer, a man named Richard, offered a tight, patronizing smile as he gestured to a leather chair at the far end of the table. He did not offer me anything to drink. He skipped the pleasantries entirely and slid a thin manila folder across the polished wood. Dr. Washington Richard began steepling his fingers. We are thrilled about the preliminary results of your livestock vaccine. However, our legal and research teams spent the night reviewing your credentials. I sat perfectly still, resting my hands on my lap. Is there a problem with my credentials, Richard? He offered a condescending chuckle that reminded me instantly of Spencer. Well, you have a standard veterinary license. You are a doctor of veterinary medicine. Our lead geneticists here at Apex hold advanced doctorates from MIT and Stanford. They specialize in molecular sequencing. You specialize in diagnosing farm animals. Because of this lack of formal genetic pedigree, the board feels that the initial offer we emailed you was a bit premature. It represents too much of a risk for our shareholders. Another executive at the table chimed in, adjusting his expensive tie. We are prepared to offer you $3 million for the full rights to the patent. It is a very generous sum for a local veterinarian. We think it is a win for everyone. I stared at the amended contract sitting in front of me. $3 million was still life-changing money, but it was less than half of their original offer and included zero equity in the company. They were trying to strong-arm me. They assumed I was so desperate to escape my small life, so dazzled by the zeros on the page, that I would just accept the lowball offer and thank them for the privilege. They expected me to shrink. My entire life, my family had trained me to shrink, to apologize for taking up space, to be grateful for whatever scraps they threw my way. I did not shrink. I calmly reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out a thick binder filled with my raw research data. I dropped it heavily onto the center of the mahogany table, making a loud thud that echoed in the quiet room. My lack of a formal genetic pedigree is exactly why I succeeded where your Stanford graduates failed, I said, my voice dangerously calm and steady. Your lead scientists have been sitting in sterile laboratories running computer simulations for 5 years, trying to isolate the RNA sequence of this porcine virus. While they were staring at screens, I was knee-deep in mud on commercial farms in rural Georgia, taking real tissue samples from dying livestock. I know exactly how this virus mutates because I have held the animals it kills. I stood up and leaned over the table, locking eyes with Richard. I flipped open the binder to the final aggregate data charts. My vaccine has a 99.9% efficacy rate in live trials. I continued, refusing to let them interrupt me. This virus currently costs the United States pork industry $2 billion every single year in lost revenue and preventative culling. $2 billion. If you acquire my patent today, Apex Biosolutions becomes the sole provider of the cure. You will monopolize the entire North American agricultural market by the end of the fiscal quarter. My patent is not a risk, gentlemen. It is the greatest financial windfall this company has seen in a decade. The boardroom was dead silent. The executive who had spoken earlier opened his mouth to argue, but Richard held up a hand to stop him. Richard looked down at my hardcore genetic data, reading the undeniable proof of my success. The condescending smile had completely vanished from his face, replaced by a stark realization that he was dealing with an absolute expert. I picked up their revised contract and slid it right back across the table to Richard. The price just went up, I told them. I want the original $6.7 million sign-on bonus. And because of the disrespect you just showed my credentials, I now require a 7% equity stake in the agricultural division moving forward. Richard blinked clearly, shocked by my demand. Dr. Washington, 7% equity is unheard of for an outside acquisition. Then I suggest you get comfortable hearing about it, I replied, picking up my leather tote bag. Because if a newly drafted contract meeting my exact demands is not sitting in front of me in the next 5 minutes, I am walking out of this room. I will take a cab straight to the headquarters of your biggest competitor, and I will hand them the monopoly instead. The choice is yours. I turned my back on the Billionaire Boys Club and started walking toward the heavy oak doors. I did not know if they would call my bluff. My heart was pounding against my ribs, but I kept my posture perfectly straight. Wait! Richard called out before I even reached the door handle. I paused and looked over my shoulder. Richard was already gesturing frantically to the corporate lawyers sitting in the corner of the room. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. "Draw up the new paperwork," he barked at the legal team. "Give her the equity stake. Do it right now." 10 minutes later, a fresh stack of legal documents was placed in front of me. The numbers were exact. $6.7 million in cash and a massive equity share in a multi-billion-dollar corporation. I picked up the heavy gold pen the lawyer handed me and signed my name on the dotted lines, officially securing my fortune and my freedom. Just as the ink dried on the final page validating my entire life's work, my cell phone began to vibrate violently in my suit pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. The caller identification flashed. It was Jasmine. I slid my thumb across the glass screen and pressed the phone to my ear. I expected to hear a hint of remorse, or maybe even a fake apology for the spectacle at Sunday dinner. I should have known better. Jasmine did not do apologies. She did not even say hello. "Spencer just got off the phone with the property manager," Jasmine announced, her voice echoing slightly over the line, as if she had me on speakerphone in her brand new car. "Your eviction notice is officially finalized. You have until 5 o'clock today to get your cheap furniture out of Grandpa's apartment before the locks are changed." I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Apex Biosolutions penthouse. Below me, the city of Chicago moved like a tiny, bustling anthill. Behind me, Richard and the legal team were quietly packing up the acquisition documents that had just made me a multi-millionaire. I took a slow sip of the sparkling water someone had handed me. Jasmine took my silence as submission. "Listen, Imani," she continued, using that sickly sweet tone she reserved for her patients and people she considered beneath her. "I know you are probably crying in a box right now, trying to figure out how you are going to survive. You always were overly emotional when things did not go your way. But I am actually feeling quite generous today. I watched a private helicopter pass by in the distance." "Generous," I repeated flatly. "Yes," Jasmine said. "I just fired my front desk receptionist at my clinic. The girl was completely incompetent. She could not even organize my chemical peel appointments correctly. Since you do not have a job and you clearly need a way to pay Grandpa back for all the money you wasted on that animal degree, I am willing to throw you a bone. You can come answer my phones." She paused, waiting for me to shower her with gratitude. When I did not say anything, she pressed on. "I will start you at $14 an hour. It is minimum wage, but let us be honest. It is more than you deserve right now. You can wear scrubs so you do not have to worry about buying professional clothes. Spencer can draft a payment plan so a portion of your check goes directly to the family trust to cover your debt. If you do a good job sweeping the floors and managing the waiting room, I might even let you park your beat-up Honda behind the clinic." This was how my sister operated. She had spent our entire childhood stepping on my neck to make herself look taller. When I won the science fair in high school, she convinced my mother to throw away my trophy because it clashed with the living room decor. When I got accepted into veterinary school, she threw a massive party for herself simply because she passed her dermatology boards on the third try. She needed me to be poor and struggling so she could feel superior. Her entire identity as the golden child depended on my failure. I turned away from the window and looked at the heavy gold pen still resting on the mahogany table. $14 an hour, I said, my voice perfectly steady. "Do not sound so ungrateful." Imani Jasmine snapped, her patience thinning. "It is a lifeline. You have absolutely nothing. You are about to be homeless. Mom and Dad are not going to bail you out this time because Grandpa explicitly forbid them from giving you a dime. You need this job. You should be thanking me." I let out a soft, genuine laugh. The sound must have caught her off guard because she stopped talking immediately. "What is so funny?" she demanded, her voice rising in pitch. "You are literally about to be sleeping on a bus bench and you are laughing at me." "I am laughing, Jasmine, because you are offering me minimum wage to sweep your floors while I am standing in a penthouse suite in Chicago," I said, keeping my tone conversational and light. "Chicago?" Jasmine scoffed. "What are you talking about? Are you having a mental breakdown, Imani? Did the stress finally crack your brain?" Spencer is right here, and he says you are probably wandering around downtown Atlanta losing your mind. I am not having a breakdown, Jasmine, I replied, tracing the edge of the leather folder that held my new fortune. I am currently in the process of buying a commercial building. I do not have time to answer your phones or organize your chemical peels. I suggest you find someone else to sweep your floors. You might want to ask Spencer to do it since he seems to have so much free time to draft fake invoices. You are delusional, Jasmine hissed, the sweet facade completely gone. You do not have a dime to your name. You are a broke animal doctor. You are making things up because you are embarrassed. Keep believing that, I said. And do not worry about Grandpa's apartment. I left the keys on the kitchen counter. You can tell Spencer to throw all that cheap furniture in the trash. I am buying brand new. You are crazy, Jasmine yelled through the speaker. When you end up on the street, do not call us. Do not call Mom. You are dead to this family. I have been dead to this family for years, I said. The only difference is now I can afford the funeral. I tapped the screen and ended the call, cutting off whatever toxic insult she was preparing to hurl next. I slid the phone into my pocket and took a deep breath. For the first time in 29 years, my chest did not feel tight. The heavy, suffocating weight of my family's expectations and their constant belittlement had vanished completely. Richard, the chief executive officer, walked over to me carrying a sleek silver briefcase. He handed it to me with a respectful nod. Everything is finalized, Dr. Washington, he said, his tone entirely different from the arrogant man who had tried to lowball me 30 minutes ago. Your private car is waiting downstairs to take you back to the airport or wherever else you need to go. I took the briefcase, feeling the solid weight of it in my hand. Thank you, Richard, I said. As I walked out of the boardroom, the executives actually stood up to see me out. I rode the private elevator down to the lobby, my mind racing with possibilities. Jasmine thought I was having a psychotic break. My parents thought I was wandering the streets of Atlanta in a panic. Spencer and Winston thought they had successfully ruined my life and secured my obedience. They were all living in a fantasy world built on their own arrogance. I walked through the revolving glass doors and stepped out into the crisp Chicago air. The black car was waiting at the curb with the door held open for me. I slid into the back seat and pulled out my phone again. There were already 3 text messages from Jasmine calling me a psycho and a liar, telling me I needed psychiatric help. I did not bother replying. Let them think I was crazy. Let them assume I had lost my mind under the pressure of their cruelty. It would only make the impending reality that much more devastating when it finally crashed down on them. Spencer sat behind his massive mahogany desk in his corner office overlooking downtown Atlanta. The soft leather chair felt like an absolute trap. He stared at the glowing screen of his laptop, his stomach churning with a violent nausea that had nothing to do with the expensive sushi he ate for lunch. He was completely broke. Worse than broke, he was drowning in a suffocating ocean of debt. For the past 2 years, he had been secretly siphoning money from Jasmine's cosmetic dermatology clinic. Jasmine was so completely obsessed with her own reflection and her elite country club status that she never bothered to look at the actual accounting ledgers. She just kept buying custom diamond rings and leasing brand new Mercedes vehicles while Spencer desperately shuffled stolen funds from one empty account to another, trying to cover his massive illegal gambling losses and his spectacularly terrible commercial real estate investments. The bank was threatening to initiate foreclosure proceedings on their custom-built suburban mansion by the end of the month. If Jasmine found out he had bankrupted them, she would completely destroy him. If Winston found out, the old man would have him disbarred and ruined in this city forever. Spencer had been sweating through his expensive tailored suits for weeks, playing the part of the wealthy, successful attorney while waiting for his entire world to collapse. He had been banking on selling Imani's car just to cover a fraction of his immediate minimum payments. He had convinced Winston to evict her just to assert his dominance and maybe squeeze some emergency cash out of her meager veterinary savings. When Jasmine told him about the bizarre phone call with Imani, claiming she was buying a building, Spencer had genuinely believed the girl had suffered a complete psychological breakdown. It made perfect sense to him at the time. The weak ones always cracked under the intense pressure of their family's black excellence. He reached for his crystal tumbler of scotch and took a slow sip, trying to steady his trembling hands. He clicked open a new browser tab and navigated to the Bloomberg Business homepage, hoping to find some miraculous shift in the financial markets that could save him. His eyes scanned the scrolling ticker tape of corporate mergers and acquisitions. Then a bold breaking news headline at the very top of the page made his breath catch sharply in his throat. Apex Biosolutions executes record-breaking acquisition of groundbreaking livestock patent from independent Atlanta geneticist. Spencer frowned his brow, furrowing in deep confusion. Apex Biosolutions was an absolute titan in the global agricultural technology sector. A record-breaking acquisition for a company of that massive size usually meant hundreds of millions of dollars exchanging hands. He clicked on the article purely out of professional curiosity, wondering which elite local law firm had managed to broker such a historic deal. He scrolled past the glossy stock photos of corporate boardrooms and read the very first paragraph of the press release. His eyes darted across the glowing screen, reading the words over and over again, until the letters started to blur together and his heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Apex Biosolutions has officially acquired the exclusive rights to a revolutionary genetic vaccine developed by independent researcher Dr. Imani Washington. The contract includes an unprecedented $6.7 million sign-on bonus and a highly coveted 7% equity stake in the agricultural division, effectively valuing the intellectual property at over $8 billion. Spencer's crystal tumbler slipped from his numb fingers and crashed onto his pristine desk, spilling amber liquid across his expensive leather blotter. He did not even flinch. He just stared at the name glowing on the screen. Dr. Imani Washington, the useless dog doctor, the ungrateful sister they had just aggressively evicted and laughed right out of the formal dining room. She had not suffered a mental breakdown at all. She had just become the wealthiest person he had ever known in his entire life. The sickening nausea in his stomach instantly evaporated, replaced by a burning, desperate greed. $6.7 million in cash right this very second, and a 7% stake in an $8 billion empire. That was hundreds of millions of dollars in generational wealth. While they were sitting around eating candied yams and mocking her for working with dirty animals, she had been quietly engineering a scientific miracle that made his entire legal career look like a high school mock trial. Spencer stood up and began pacing the length of his spacious office, his mind racing with a terrifying speed. He thought about the harsh eviction notice he had personally drafted just the night before. He thought about the residential apartment lease she had signed with Winston's property management company 3 years ago. His predatory legal brain started pulling apart every single interaction, every single financial document, and every single piece of paper she had ever touched within the family business network. There had to be a loophole he could exploit. There had to be a hidden clause he could weaponize against her. Winston owned the apartment building she lived in. Winston had paid for portions of her undergraduate degree years ago before cutting her off for choosing veterinary medicine. Spencer himself had drafted a very broad general family trust document a few years back that included incredibly vague language about shared familial assets and intellectual property developed while residing in company-owned properties. It was meant to protect Winston's real estate developments, but in the hands of a desperate and ruthless attorney, that vague language could be twisted into a weapon of mass destruction. A slow, wicked smile spread across his face. He stopped pacing and looked back at the glowing computer screen. Imani thought she could just walk away. She thought she could take her billions and leave them all behind to drown in their own debt. She was incredibly smart with animal genetics, but she was completely naive when it came to corporate law. She had conducted her research while living in an apartment owned by the family trust. She had used electricity and resources paid for by Winston's holding company. In the eyes of a greedy attorney and a sympathetic judge that made her research the property of the Washington family, Spencer did not waste another second. He grabbed his cell phone from his desk and dialed Winston's private number. He listened to it ring 3 times before the old patriarch finally answered with a gruff, impatient greeting. Spencer kept his voice low and urgent, practically vibrating with a toxic mixture of salvation and pure malice. Grandpa, we have a massive problem, Spencer said, pacing back to the window to look out over the Atlanta skyline. But we also have a massive opportunity. I need you to listen to me very carefully. Imani did not go crazy. She did not lose her mind. She just hit the absolute jackpot. She sold a patent to Apex Biosolutions for millions of dollars and a huge equity stake. The little vet is sitting on a literal gold mine. He paused, listening to Winston's sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Before the old man could start shouting, Spencer delivered his killing blow. "Do not worry, Grandpa." Spencer said, a dark, satisfied grin twisting his features. "She thinks she has escaped us, but she is dead wrong. She developed that patent on our property. I am looking at the trust documents right now, and I know exactly how we can legally take every single penny away from her." I flew back to Atlanta the very next morning. I did not waste any time. I hired a premium moving company to clear out the few personal belongings I still cared about from my grandfather's dingy apartment. By noon, I was standing in the center of my brand new luxury condo in Buckhead. The space was immaculate, featuring imported Italian marble floors and custom fixtures. It was a massive upgrade from the cramped space my family had used to control me for years. I had paid for the entire year up front, using a tiny fraction of my new wealth. The moving team was carefully carrying in my new modern furniture while I stood by the kitchen island, reviewing fabric swatches for the living room. I was directing the movers on where to place my heavy boxes when my cell phone started vibrating frantically on the marble kitchen counter. I walked over and looked at the glowing screen. It was my mother, Yolanda. She had not called me once since the night they kicked me out of the family dinner. I stared at the phone, debating whether to answer it. After everything they had done, I owed them absolutely nothing. But the phone kept ringing with a persistent urgency. I swiped the screen and brought the device to my ear. I did not even get a chance to say hello before I heard the hysterical sobbing. Yolanda was gasping for air, her voice cracking with raw, unadulterated panic. She begged me to come to the hospital immediately. She screamed that Grandpa Winston had suffered a massive stroke. She said he was completely unresponsive and the doctors were not sure if he was going to make it through the afternoon. She told me the entire family was gathering at Atlanta General Hospital to say their final goodbyes. My heart dropped straight into my stomach. For my entire life, Winston had been a cruel tyrant. He had mocked my dreams and belittled my career. He had evicted me out into the street without a second thought. But he was still my grandfather. In that split second, all the bitter anger and deep resentment I felt toward him was temporarily swallowed by a sudden rush of pure adrenaline and familiar fear. I told my mother I was on my way and ended the call. I left the movers with strict instructions and sprinted down to the private parking garage. I jumped into my rental car and sped through the busy Atlanta streets, breaking several traffic laws to get to the hospital faster. The sky above Atlanta was a bruised gray, threatening heavy rain. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My tires screeched as I took tight corners, ignoring stoplights and honking horns. My mind was racing with terrifying images of Winston lying in a sterile hospital bed hooked up to loud life support machines. I wondered if he would even be conscious when I arrived, or if I would be too late. I wondered if I would get the chance to tell him that I had finally succeeded before he passed away. I thought about my mother Yolanda, and how devastated she must be to lose the man who controlled every single aspect of her life. When I burst through the sliding glass doors of Atlanta General Hospital, I practically ran to the front desk. I gave the receptionist Winston's name, fully expecting her to direct me to the intensive care unit. Instead, the woman looked at her computer screen and offered a polite, friendly smile. She told me the Washington family had secured a private suite in the VIP wing on the top floor. She handed me a glossy visitor pass and pointed toward the private elevators. I did not stop to think about how strange it was that a man fighting for his life was not in the emergency ward. I rode the elevator up to the top floor, my hands shaking violently with anxiety. The top floor of Atlanta General Hospital was reserved exclusively for the ultra-wealthy and the politically connected. The doors opened to a quiet, pristine hallway, lined with expensive original artwork and plush, thick carpeting that absorbed the sound of my footsteps. It felt more like a five-star luxury hotel than a place where people came to heal or die. A private nurse wearing crisp white scrubs was waiting for me at the end of the long hall. She checked my visitor pass and gestured toward heavy double oak doors at the end of the corridor. She told me my family was waiting for me inside the private conference room. I took a deep breath, bracing myself for the heartbreaking sight of my grieving parents and my dying grandfather. I pushed the heavy wooden doors open and stepped into the room. The room was incredibly spacious, featuring a massive mahogany table and plush leather seating. There was no hospital bed. There were no heart monitors. There were no doctors rushing around trying to save a life. Sitting at the very head of the polished conference table was Winston. He was wearing a perfectly tailored gray suit. His color was excellent. He was not hooked up to any machines. In fact, he was holding a crystal glass filled with expensive amber scotch. He looked completely and utterly healthy. Sitting right next to him was Spencer. My golden child brother-in-law leaned back in his leather chair with a sickeningly arrogant smirk plastered across his face. He had a thick stack of legal documents resting on the table in front of him. I stood frozen in the doorway, my brain struggling to process the bizarre scene in front of me. I looked around the large room expecting to see my mother Yolanda. She was nowhere to be found. The hysterical sobbing woman who had begged me to rush to the hospital was completely absent. I looked back at Winston. He took a slow sip of his scotch and set the glass down on the wooden table. He did not look like a man who had just suffered a massive stroke. He looked like a ruthless predator who had just successfully trapped his prey. It took exactly 3 seconds for the reality of the terrible situation to hit me. There was no stroke. There was no medical emergency. The entire frantic phone call had been a carefully orchestrated lie designed to manipulate my emotions and force me to drop everything and rush straight into their waiting clutches. Spencer let out a low, mocking chuckle. He tapped his expensive gold pen against the stack of legal documents and looked at me with greedy, calculating eyes. He told me it was very touching to see how fast I came running when I thought the family patriarch was dying. He said it proved that despite my rebellious little attitude, I still remembered my proper place in the Washington family hierarchy. My initial panic instantly evaporated, replaced by a white-hot rage that burned through my entire body. I stared at the two men sitting across from me, realizing exactly what was happening. They had seen the financial news. Spencer must have found out about the Apex Biosolutions deal while scrolling through the market reports. They knew about the $6.7 million and the unprecedented equity stake. They knew I was no longer the broke, desperate girl they could easily kick out on the street. They knew I possessed the kind of wealth that eclipsed even their own. I asked Winston how he could possibly fake a medical emergency just to get me in a room. I asked him if there was any limit to the amount of manipulation and dark deceit this family was willing to use against me. Winston did not even have the decency to look ashamed. He rested his weathered hands on the table and fixed me with a cold, authoritative stare. He told me that extreme situations require extreme measures. He said I had been ignoring their phone calls, and they needed to have an urgent conversation with me regarding family assets. Spencer leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished table. He pointed his pen directly at me. He stated that I had made a very lucrative deal with Apex Biosolutions. He said he read all about my groundbreaking genetic research and the millions of dollars that were currently sitting in my private bank accounts. His eyes gleamed with a desperate, toxic greed as he stared at me. Then Spencer delivered the exact threat he had dragged me all the way here to make. He told me that I developed that livestock patent while living in an apartment owned by the Washington Family Trust. He claimed that because I used family resources and lived under their roof to conduct my research, the intellectual property did not legally or rightfully belong to me. He said my veterinary research and my genetic notes belonged to Winston, and by extension the rest of the Washington family empire. He smiled that awful smug smile showing all of his perfectly white teeth. He told me I was going to sign every single penny of my new fortune over to the family trust today, or they were going to tie me up in endless corporate litigation until I had absolutely nothing left to my name. I stood perfectly still, letting the deafening silence of the room press against my shoulders. The sheer audacity of their plan was almost difficult to comprehend. My mother Yolanda had staged a completely hysterical performance, crying over a fake stroke, just to lure me into a room where my grandfather and my brother-in-law could ambush me for my money. I looked at Winston, expecting to see even a tiny fraction of guilt or hesitation in his old, weathered eyes. Instead, he just swirled the amber liquid in his crystal glass, looking at me like I was a rebellious employee who had stepped out of line. He took another slow sip of his expensive scotch, completely unbothered by the cruel trap he had just sprung on his own granddaughter. Winston finally spoke, his voice echoing with the same harsh, demanding authority that had terrified our family for decades. He told me to wipe that defiant look off my face and sit down. He said I had spent my entire life disrespecting the Washington family name and running away from my responsibilities. He reminded me that he was the absolute patriarch of this family, and he demanded total obedience from everyone who shared his blood. He said he had built this massive family empire from the ground up, working his fingers to the bone to ensure we all had a legacy. He told me he would not allow a stubborn little girl to hoard a massive fortune that rightfully belonged to the empire he had created. He spoke with such total conviction that for a brief second, I wondered if he actually believed his own twisted logic. Spencer did not waste another second. He picked up the thick stack of legal documents resting in front of him and slid it forcefully across the polished mahogany table. The heavy paper coasted over the smooth wood and stopped right at the edge of the table directly in front of me. The document was covered in dense legal jargon and bright yellow sticky notes marking exactly where I was supposed to sign my entire life away. The title on the front page declared it was an intellectual property transfer agreement. I looked down at the paper and then back up at Spencer. His arrogant smirk had grown even wider, stretching across his face like a predator, admiring a trapped animal. He leaned back in his expensive leather chair, steepling his fingers together. He told me I really should have paid more attention when I signed my residential lease 3 years ago. He explained that the apartment building I lived in was completely owned and operated by Winston's primary holding company. He said my name was on a lease agreement that included a very specific and very broad clause regarding any intellectual property generated on the premises. Spencer slowly stood up and began walking around the edge of the massive table, his footsteps completely silent on the plush hospital carpet. He told me that under strict Georgia intellectual property law, any research or patents developed using company resources automatically became the sole property of the company itself. He smiled, showing all of his perfectly white teeth, as he listed off all the ways I was legally bound to their empire. He said I had developed my groundbreaking genetic vaccine while living under a roof paid for by the family trust. He said I had used electricity and internet access that were billed directly to Winston's corporate accounts. He claimed that every single late night I spent researching livestock genetics in my small living room was legally considered company time using company resources. Therefore, Spencer continued, his voice dripping with fake sugary sympathy. The intellectual property you just sold to Apex Biosolutions never actually belonged to you, Imani. It belongs to the Washington Family Trust. You sold our property without our direct permission, and that makes you guilty of blatant corporate theft. My chest felt incredibly tight as I listened to him twist my years of exhausting independent research into a cheap legal loophole. I had spent countless nights crying over my microscope, eating cheap ramen noodles, and sacrificing my entire social life to perfect that vaccine. They had completely ignored me the entire time. They had mocked my veterinary degree and called me a useless dog doctor whenever they had the chance. They had never offered me a single dime to fund my research or support my experiments. But now that my hard work had translated into billions of dollars, they were suddenly eager to claim it as their own brilliant family investment. The sheer hypocrisy of their sudden interest in my career made my blood boil. Spencer stopped walking and stood right next to me, tapping the thick legal document with his manicured finger. He told me the family was actually feeling incredibly generous today. He said Winston was willing to overlook the corporate theft and let me keep a tiny fraction of the Apex Biosolutions money. He stated that the document in front of me legally transferred exactly 80% of my cash payout and 80% of my new equity stake directly into the Washington Family Trust. He said if I signed on the dotted line right now, they would let me walk away with the remaining 20%, and they would entirely drop the threat of pressing criminal charges against me. I stared at the black ink on the page, feeling a cold knot form deep in the pit of my stomach. Winston slammed his glass down on the table, breaking the quiet tension in the room. The loud, sudden crack made me flinch. He leaned far over the mahogany table, pointing a weathered, shaking finger directly at my chest. His voice was no longer calm and collected. It was a vicious, threatening growl that echoed off the sterile hospital walls. He told me I was going to pick up a pen and sign that document right this very second without asking any more foolish questions. He warned me that if I refused to cooperate, he would unleash a massive fleet of relentless corporate lawyers on me by tomorrow morning. He promised to file endless injunctions to completely freeze my bank accounts and stall the Apex Biosolutions deal indefinitely. He threatened to drag me through the court system for decades, tying up my money in so much bureaucratic red tape that I would not be able to afford a single piece of bread, let alone a luxury condo. He said he would personally ensure that I was bankrupted, ruined, and publicly humiliated before the year was over. The heavy wooden doors behind me felt like they were locked tight. I was standing completely alone in a soundproof room with two of the most ruthless men in the entire city of Atlanta. Spencer held out his expensive gold pen, offering it to me with a dark, victorious gleam in his eye. I looked down at the contract, feeling the crushing, suffocating weight of their trap pressing down on my shoulders. The words blurred together on the page as my mind raced to find a way out of the nightmare they had constructed. I stood there staring at the paper, appearing completely and utterly cornered. I looked down at the thick stack of paper resting on the polished mahogany table, and then I looked up at the two men who had made my entire life a living hell. Spencer was still holding out his expensive gold pen, his arm extended like he was offering me a lifeline instead of a noose. Winston sat back in his chair, taking another slow, arrogant sip of his scotch, waiting for my inevitable surrender. They expected me to cry. They expected me to beg for their mercy. They expected me to fold exactly the way my mother Yolanda always folded whenever Winston raised his voice. I reached out and took the gold pen from Spencer's hand. His smug smile grew so wide it looked like it might split his face right in half. He tapped his manicured finger against the signature line at the very bottom of the page. "Right there, Imani," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Just sign right there, and we can put all this ugly family business behind us, and you can go back to your little animals." I did not look at the signature line. I looked directly into his eyes, and I snapped his expensive gold pen right in half. The dark ink exploded across my hands and splattered onto the pristine white pages of his flawless legal document. Spencer gasped and jumped back his chair, scraping loudly against the hospital floor as the black ink stained the cuffs of his tailored suit and speckled his silk tie. Before either of them could say a single word, I grabbed the entire stack of intellectual property transfer documents. The heavy paper felt thick and substantial in my hands, but I did not care. I ripped the entire packet straight down the middle. I tore the thick stack into quarters, using every ounce of pent-up frustration and strength I had in my hands. I threw the shredded pieces directly at Spencer's chest. The torn pages fluttered through the air like heavy snow, covering the mahogany table and scattering across the expensive hospital carpet. "What the hell are you doing?" Spencer yelled frantically, brushing the ink and shredded paper off his lap. "You stupid little girl," Winston roared, slamming his crystal glass down so hard the amber liquid sloshed over the rim. "You are making the biggest mistake of your pathetic life." I stood up completely straight and planted my hands firmly on the table, leaning in close so the old patriarch could see exactly how unafraid I was. "I am not making a mistake," I said, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly steady. "I am finally fixing one. I am finally cutting the dead weight out of my life." "You ungrateful brat," Winston snarled, his weathered face turning a dark shade of purple. "I gave you everything. I put a solid roof over your head. I paid for the electricity you used to build your little science project. That genetic research belongs to the Washington Empire. You owe this family everything you have. I let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed through the massive VIP hospital room. You gave me nothing, Winston, I said, staring him down, refusing to blink. You bought Jasmine a $200,000 wedding just so she could show off for her elite country club friends. You bought her brand new luxury cars and paid for her cosmetic clinic while you forced me to live in a crumbling roach-infested apartment. You made me pay rent every single month while I was trying to survive on a veterinary assistant's salary. And now you sit there and claim that my $50 a month internet bill entitles you to my life work. You think paying for the electricity I used to run my microscope means you own my brain and my future. Spencer recovered from his shock and stepped forward, trying to regain control of the room and salvage his trap. The law does not care about your petty hurt feelings, Imani, he sneered, wiping wet ink from his hands with a handkerchief. The law cares about contracts and property rights. You used company resources to develop a patent. That makes it company property. It is black and white corporate law. You cannot outsmart me in a courtroom. It is desperate extortion, I corrected him, turning my glare to Spencer. You are completely broke, Spencer. I saw the way you looked at those acquisition numbers. You do not care about the family empire, and you certainly do not care about Winston. You are drowning in debt, and you are looking for a massive payout to save your own skin before Jasmine finds out you bankrupted her. You are a terrible lawyer and a worse businessman, and I am not going to be your personal bailout fund. Winston's eyes narrowed into angry little slits, his jaw clenching with pure rage. You think you can walk out of here with my money? He asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous, menacing whisper. I will ruin you, Imani. I will hire a team of corporate litigators so large they will block out the sun. I will tie your precious Apex Biosolutions money up in endless court battles for the next 3 decades. You will be an old broken woman before you ever see a single penny of that fortune. I will bankrupt you in legal fees alone until you come crawling back here begging for my forgiveness. Bring them on, I said, grabbing my purse from the back of my chair. Bring every single lawyer you can find, Winston, because I can afford to fight you now. I have the entire legal department of a global agricultural technology titan backing my patent. Apex Biosolutions is not going to let a local Atlanta real estate bully steal an $8 billion genetic vaccine over a fake Wi-Fi dispute. They will crush you and your holding company into absolute dust. I turned my back on both of them and walked toward the heavy oak doors, feeling a massive weight lift off my shoulders. The air in the room suddenly felt fresh and breathable. I was completely done playing their twisted family games. I was done seeking their approval. I reached out and grabbed the brass door handle. See you in court, I said without looking back. I pulled the heavy door open, ready to walk down the hall and never look back at either of them ever again. But Spencer's voice sliced through the silence, stopping me right in my tracks. We do not need to wait for court, Imani. Spencer called out, his voice thick with a dark, triumphant malice. He sounded completely unfazed by my threats. He sounded like a man who is holding the ultimate trump card. I paused in the doorway, my hand gripping the brass handle. My pulse throbbed in my ears as a sudden wave of dread washed over me. You really think I would drag you all the way down here without having a solid backup plan? Spencer sneered slowly, walking around the table to stand behind Winston. You think I am just making empty threats to scare you? While you were driving here thinking your grandfather was dying, I was busy filing an emergency ex parte motion with a very sympathetic Superior Court judge. I cited extreme corporate theft and immediate flight risk. My heart did a painful stutter in my chest. I slowly turned my head to look back at him. Spencer was smiling that awful predatory smile again, leaning casually against the back of Winston's chair, looking like he had just won the lottery. The judge signed the order 10 minutes before you walked into this room, Spencer said, casually checking his expensive watch. Your accounts at Apex Biosolutions are officially frozen. Every single penny of your $6.7 million sign-on bonus is completely locked down by the state of Georgia. Your bank accounts will be entirely frozen by 5 o'clock today. You are walking out of this hospital with absolutely nothing, just like you came in. I stared at Spencer for a long, heavy moment before turning on my heel and walking out the heavy oak doors. I did not run, and I did not look back. My footsteps were silent on the plush carpet of the VIP wing, but my mind was screaming. Spencer had actually done it. He had used his sleazy legal connections to freeze my entire life. I rode the elevator down to the lobby, feeling a cold, terrible numbness spreading through my chest. I walked out into the humid Atlanta afternoon air and got into my rental car. I drove aimlessly for an hour trying to process the sheer scale of their betrayal. The adrenaline was slowly fading, leaving behind a hollow, gnawing hunger in my stomach. I pulled into the parking lot of an upscale bistro in Buckhead, needing a quiet place to sit and strategize. I sat down in a leather booth in the back corner of the restaurant, staring blankly at the menu. I ordered a simple salad and a glass of sparkling water. My phone sat perfectly silent on the table. The food tasted like cardboard ash in my mouth, but I forced myself to eat, knowing I needed to keep my strength up. When the waiter brought the leather bill folder, I pulled out my sleek new corporate credit card, tied directly to my Apex Biosolutions Advance account. I placed it on the tray and waited. 2 minutes later, the waiter returned, looking incredibly uncomfortable. He kept his voice low and apologetic as he explained that the card had been declined. A hot flush of intense embarrassment crept up my neck. I told him it must be a bank error and handed him my personal debit card tied to my old veterinary savings account. He walked away and returned even faster this time. He placed the card on the table and shook his head. He told me that one was declined as well. He said the system returned a message stating the accounts were entirely frozen by a court order. The reality of Spencer's threat hit me like a physical punch to the gut. He had not just frozen the corporate millions, he had frozen the meager savings I had built over years of working 12-hour shifts at the animal clinic. He had literally cut off my ability to buy a basic meal. I had to dig into the bottom of my purse and pull out a crumpled $50 bill just to cover my lunch and leave a tip. I walked out of the restaurant and sat in the driver's seat of my rental car, feeling completely exposed and vulnerable. Before I could even put the keys in the ignition, my phone began to vibrate violently against the center console. The caller ID flashed with my mother Yolanda's name. I stared at it, feeling a fresh wave of absolute disgust. She was the one who had lured me into the hospital trap with her fake hysterical sobbing. I swiped the screen and answered the call, putting her on speakerphone. Yolanda did not sound hysterical anymore. Her voice was smooth and careful, coated in that fake maternal warmth she used whenever she wanted to manipulate me into compliance. She told me she was so incredibly sorry about how things went down in the hospital room. She said Winston and Spencer could be a little aggressive sometimes, but they really just had the best interests of the entire Washington family at heart. My father chimed in on the background, putting himself on the call. He played the calm, reasoning peacekeeper. He told me I was being unreasonable and making things unnecessarily difficult for everyone. My mother let out a soft, practiced sigh. She told me that Spencer was willing to be flexible if I just showed a little bit of respect. She said all I had to do was transfer $3 million to Spencer's private accounts to help him cover some bad real estate investments he had made. She promised that if I just gave him the $3 million, Spencer would immediately lift the ex parte motion and unfreeze the rest of my money. My father agreed, telling me $3 million was a very small price to pay to keep the family together and avoid a massive public scandal. They were actually trying to play the good cops. They were actively helping Spencer extort me to save his own pathetic career while framing it as a desperate plea for family unity. I gripped the steering wheel tight enough to make my hands ache. I told them they were completely delusional if they thought I was going to pay a $3 million ransom to the very people who had abused me my entire life. I said Spencer made a huge mistake thinking he could starve me into submission. I told my mother she was a coward for helping them set the trap, and I told my father he was pathetic for standing by and watching it happen. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, cutting off whatever toxic manipulation they were planning to say next. I was not going to fold. I was not going to give them a single dime. They thought I was alone and defenseless, but they completely forgot who I was in business with now. I picked up my phone again and scrolled through my contacts until I found the direct private number for Richard, the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Biosolutions. He answered on the second ring, his voice crisp and professional. I did not waste any time with pleasantries. I told him exactly what my family had done. I explained the ex parte motion, the frozen assets, and the extortion attempt. Richard was silent for exactly 2 seconds before his voice dropped into a deadly serious tone. He told me to drive straight to the Apex Biosolutions regional headquarters in Midtown Atlanta. He said nobody touches an Apex partner and gets away with it. He told me he was calling in his absolute best corporate litigator immediately. I drove across town and walked into the towering glass and steel building. An executive assistant escorted me straight up to the top floor boardroom. Richard was waiting for me standing next to a tall, sharp-looking man in an immaculate dark suit. Richard introduced him as Richard Harrison, the senior partner and lead attack dog for the Apex Biosolutions global legal team. Harrison had a massive reputation for completely dismantling huge corporations and leaving nothing but ashes behind. I sat down at the glass table and explained every detail of Spencer's ridiculous family trust loophole. I logged into my laptop and pulled up the digital copies of the residential lease and the ex parte motion Spencer had somehow managed to push through the local courts. Harrison leaned over my shoulder, reading the documents with a calm, calculating focus. The room was perfectly quiet as he scanned Spencer's legal arguments and the supposed ironclad clauses Winston was using to claim ownership of my vaccine. Richard Harrison stood up and adjusted his expensive silk tie. He looked down at Spencer's lawsuit and let out a deep, booming laugh that echoed off the glass walls of the boardroom. He shook his head and tossed the printed copy of the motion onto the table like it was a piece of actual garbage. He looked at me with a brilliant, terrifying smile. He said this white boy thinks he is incredibly smart for finding a standard property loophole. He leaned over and planted his hands on the table, his eyes locking onto mine with absolute predatory confidence. He told me to sit back and relax because they were about to show Spencer exactly what a billion-dollar legal team looks like. The cold, sterile air of the deposition room felt like a freezer, but Spencer was sweating profusely. It had been exactly 10 days since I crashed his lavish expansion party and delivered the news that Apex Biosolutions had bought his private equity loan. The reality of his impending financial ruin hung heavy in the room. He looked absolutely haggard. His usually pristine designer suit hung loosely on his shoulders, and there were dark, exhausted circles under his eyes. He was a desperate man fighting for his absolute survival, and he thought this deposition was his final chance to corner me and save himself from total bankruptcy. The little red light on the video camera blinked silently from the corner of the room. The court reporter sat at the end of the long glass table, typing away with rhythmic, mechanical precision. I sat perfectly still with my hands folded neatly in my lap. Right beside me sat Richard Harrison, the Apex Biosolutions lead litigator, looking like a calm, unbothered panther waiting in the tall grass. He had not spoken a single word since we sat down, simply watching Spencer pace back and forth in front of the camera. Spencer leaned across the table, placing his hands flat on the glass, trying to project an aura of intimidating authority that he simply no longer possessed. He looked at me with a condescending sneer, attempting to use the same psychological warfare that Winston had always used to keep the women in our family obedient and quiet. He told me that we needed to stop playing games and get down to the truth. He spoke to me like I was a confused little girl in way over her head, using a slow, patronizing tone. He said that a young, inexperienced woman like myself working a low-paying animal grooming job could not possibly comprehend the massive infrastructure required to develop a groundbreaking genetic patent. I kept my expression entirely blank and told him I was a licensed veterinary geneticist, not a pet groomer. Spencer waved his hand dismissively, chuckling for the camera, as if my medical degree was just a cute little hobby. He said I could call it whatever I wanted, but the undeniable fact remained that I did not have the personal capital to fund a multi-billion-dollar research project. He leaned in closer. his voice dropping into a faux sympathetic whisper. He said he understood how overwhelming all this big corporate science must be for someone of my background. He suggested that I was just a naive girl who got incredibly lucky playing around on a laptop that was connected to the Washington Family Enterprise grid. He aggressively stated that I had run my complex data simulations using the high-speed commercial internet provided exclusively by my apartment building, which was owned entirely by Winston's primary holding company. I looked down at my hands, letting my shoulders slump just a tiny fraction. I made myself look nervous and hesitant, entirely playing into the helpless victim role he was so desperate to assign me. I told him I did not really understand how internet servers worked. I said I just used my personal computer in my living room, and I did not recall exactly how much data I was transferring on any given night. I stammered slightly, looking over at Richard Harrison with wide, uncertain eyes as if I were pleading for help. Richard Harrison did not move a single muscle, but I saw the absolute faintest glimmer of amusement flash in his dark eyes. I was playing the bait perfectly, and Spencer was biting down as hard as he could. Seeing my apparent weakness, Spencer's chest puffed out with victorious arrogance. He practically lunged for his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of printed documents. He slammed them down onto the glass table right in front of the camera. He proudly declared that he had subpoenaed the digital access logs and the internet service provider records for the exact dates I had been developing the vaccine. He stared down at me with malicious triumph, pointing a shaky finger at the highlighted lines of data on the paper. He stated for the official record that these logs proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that massive continuous streams of data had been routed through the apartment building's private servers directly from my unit. He claimed this was irrefutable concrete evidence that I had used Washington Family resources to conduct my research. He turned to the court reporter and officially submitted the entire stack of documents into evidence, demanding they be marked as Exhibit A. The room was silent for a long, heavy moment. Spencer wiped the sweat from his forehead, looking incredibly satisfied with his brilliant legal trap. He truly believed he had just checkmated me on camera. That was when Richard Harrison finally moved. He slowly reached into the inner pocket of his impeccably tailored suit jacket. His movements were smooth and unhurried, exuding a terrifying level of control. He looked across the table at Spencer, his voice smooth and deadly quiet. He asked Spencer to confirm, under the strict penalty of perjury, that these specific data logs were officially extracted from the apartment building's commercial servers on the dates listed in the margin. Spencer scoffed, rolling his eyes at the question. He stated loudly and clearly for the camera that the logs were absolutely authentic and officially verified by his own independent cybersecurity experts. He said there was no escaping the digital footprint I had left behind. Richard Harrison let out a low, chilling laugh that seemed to suck all the warmth right out of the freezing room. He looked at Spencer's lawsuit and shook his head with genuine pity. He slowly pulled a thick manila envelope from his jacket and placed it on the glass table. He said it was incredibly fascinating to see those specific data logs entered into a federal court record because they presented a rather massive physical impossibility. Harrison slid the envelope across the table until it touched Spencer's fake evidence. He told Spencer that he was looking at an official classified report from the Federal Department of Energy. Harrison smiled, showing his teeth, as he explained that for the exact 6-month period, Spencer was claiming I was using the apartment Wi-Fi. I had actually been granted top-secret clearance to work inside a federally secured underground laboratory in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. He stated that I was not even living in the state of Georgia during the time those logs were supposedly generated, and my apartment had been completely vacant with the power shut off. Harrison leaned forward, his voice dripping with lethal corporate authority, and told Spencer that submitting entirely fabricated evidence in a federal deposition was a career-ending felony. He watched the absolute terror wash over Spencer's face and told him he was about to learn exactly what a billion-dollar legal team looks like. The heavy silence in the deposition room was broken only by the rhythmic clicking of the court reporter's keyboard, capturing every single second of Spencer's spectacular downfall. I watched the blood completely drain from Spencer's face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray as he stared down at the official federal document resting on the glass table. His eyes darted frantically back and forth across the page, desperately searching for a loophole or a typo that would save him from the absolute nightmare he had just walked into. But there was no loophole. The seal of the federal government was printed clearly at the top of the page, confirming my top secret clearance and my placement in the underground laboratory. Spencer opened his mouth to speak, but all that came out was a dry, pathetic wheeze. He looked at Winston, expecting the powerful family patriarch to intervene and save him. But Winston was staring at the federal document with a look of profound confusion and mounting fury. The old man had spent his entire life bullying local business owners and intimidating family members. But he knew absolutely nothing about navigating federal agricultural laws or dealing with classified government facilities. He suddenly realized that he had marched into a battle he could not possibly win, guided by a son-in-law who had just made a catastrophic error. I let out a slow, steady breath and leaned forward, resting my arms on the cool glass table. I completely dropped the facade of the terrified, naive girl I had been playing for the last hour. My voice was no longer soft or hesitant. It was firm, clear, and echoing with the absolute certainty of a woman who had meticulously planned every single step of her defense. I told Spencer to look very closely at the secondary funding source listed on page 2 of that document. I explained that the clearance was only part of the story. My genetic research was completely funded by a massive, highly restricted federal agricultural grant. I told him that because of the sensitive nature of the livestock genome, I was mapping the federal government required the work to be done in an isolated, heavily guarded environment. I explained that my research was not conducted in my cramped apartment living room over a cheap commercial internet connection. It was conducted entirely inside a highly secure restricted access biolab on the campus of a premier historically black college and university. I watched Spencer's eyes widen in pure terror as I laid out the reality of my life over the past 3 years. I told him that the university had partnered directly with the Department of Energy and the Department of Agriculture to provide me with a state-of-the-art laboratory. I explained that every single hour I spent analyzing DNA, every single simulation I ran, and every single drop of data I generated happened behind multiple layers of biometric security on that campus. I never took my work home. I never connected my encrypted research laptop to the unsecured residential network at his little apartment building. In fact, I told him I had barely even slept at that apartment for the last 6 months of my research because the grant provided me with secure housing directly adjacent to the campus laboratory. Richard Harrison sat beside me looking like a proud predator, watching his trap snap completely shut. He pointed a long, elegant finger at the thick stack of printed internet logs Spencer had so proudly submitted into evidence just moments before. Harrison asked Spencer how exactly a woman who was living on a secure campus and working inside a federal laboratory hundreds of miles away managed to generate massive amounts of daily internet traffic from an empty apartment in Atlanta. Harrison did not raise his voice, but the deadly calm of his tone made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He explained that federal agricultural grants come with incredibly strict, non-negotiable stipulations regarding intellectual property. He stated that any patent generated under that specific grant legally belongs entirely to the creator and the federal government. He told Spencer that there was absolutely no legal universe where a local real estate holding company could claim ownership of a federally funded agricultural patent simply because my name was on a residential lease. Winston finally comprehended the sheer magnitude of the disaster. He slowly turned his head to look at Spencer, his eyes burning with a dark, vicious hatred. The great patriarch realized that his brilliant lawyer had not just lost the case, but had actively handed our enemies the exact weapon they needed to destroy the Washington family empire. I looked directly into the camera lens, ensuring my next words were captured perfectly for the official legal record. I told Spencer that I knew he was desperate for cash to save his failing real estate investments. I said I knew he needed a quick, massive payout to keep Jasmine happy and ignorant of their impending bankruptcy. But I told him his desperation had made him incredibly sloppy. I pointed to the fake internet logs he had submitted as Exhibit A. I told him that whoever he hired to forge those data logs had done a truly pathetic job because they showed me downloading massive files on days when the apartment building itself had reported power outages. Harrison leaned in close to the microphone on the table. He told Spencer that submitting falsified documents to extort a family member was bad enough, but doing it during an official deposition was a fatal miscalculation. He reminded Spencer that he had just sworn under the strict penalty of perjury that those fabricated logs were completely authentic and verified. He had officially entered forged digital evidence into a federal intellectual property dispute involving a government-funded patent. Spencer began to shake violently, his hands trembling as he reached for the stack of fake papers, trying to pull them back across the table. But Harrison swiftly placed his hand firmly over the documents, locking them in place. Harrison smiled a dark, ruthless smile that promised absolute ruin. He told Spencer it was far too late to take the evidence back. The court reporter had already recorded his sworn statements, and the camera had captured his confident admission of authenticity. Spencer stared at the fake logs, realizing that his arrogant attempt to steal my life work had just instantly morphed into a federal perjury charge that would guarantee the immediate loss of his law license and inevitably result in a very long prison sentence. The heavy oak doors of the deposition room swung open, and Richard Harrison did not waste a single second. He grabbed the freshly printed deposition transcript and marched straight down the hall to demand an immediate emergency hearing with the presiding judge. I walked closely behind him, feeling a deep sense of absolute peace settling over my entire body. We walked right into the judge's private chambers, and Harrison placed the sworn transcript directly next to the federal agricultural grant documents. He slid the entire stack across the massive wooden desk and stepped back with his hands folded perfectly behind his back. The judge put on his reading glasses and began to scan the highlighted sections of the federal mandate, comparing them to the internet logs Spencer had just proudly submitted. I watched the color violently rise in the judge's cheeks as the sheer magnitude of the fraud became apparent. Spencer stood trembling before the bench, looking less like a high-powered corporate attorney and more like a terrified cornered rat. He was sweating completely through his expensive silk shirt, and his breathing was shallow and erratic. The judge did not even ask Spencer to provide a defense. He looked at him with absolute unvarnished disgust and declared the intellectual property lawsuit completely dead on arrival. The judge immediately signed a binding court order unfreezing every single one of my personal and corporate bank accounts, restoring my entire life with the stroke of a pen. Then the judge slammed his wooden gavel down and slapped Spencer with a devastating $200,000 financial sanction for maliciously wasting the court's time. The judge looked Spencer dead in the eyes and said he was personally forwarding the video footage of the deposition to the State Bar Association and the district attorney for immediate felony perjury and fraud charges. We walked out of the heavy courtroom doors and stepped out into the long, echoey marble hallway of the federal courthouse. Winston and Jasmine were waiting patiently on the wooden benches outside. They had been fully expecting Spencer to walk out with a victorious, arrogant smile and a signed settlement giving them total control of my billions of dollars in medical patents. Instead, Spencer stumbled out of the doors looking like a hollow, shattered shell of a human being. Winston stood up, gripping his gold-handled cane tightly, and demanded to know why the hearing was over so quickly. Spencer could barely form a coherent sentence as his voice cracked in his throat. He stammered out that the entire lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice, and the judge was actively pursuing federal perjury charges against him. He confessed to Winston that my research was federally protected by a massive government grant, and they had walked blindly right into a catastrophic corporate trap. The arrogant, confident mask Winston had worn my entire life shattered into a million jagged pieces. He stared at Spencer with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred, realizing that his golden son-in-law was nothing but an incompetent fraud. Without saying a single word, Winston raised his heavy hand and slapped Spencer directly across the face with all his strength. The sharp, violent cracking sound echoed loudly down the long marble corridor, making several passing lawyers and security guards stop and stare in shock. Spencer stumbled backward, holding his rapidly reddening cheek, completely humiliated in front of his wife and the public. Winston spat on the ground and called Spencer a pathetic, useless failure who had just brought irreversible disgrace to the entire Washington family name. Jasmine did not rush forward to comfort her bleeding, crying husband. Instead, she let out a loud, terrifying scream that bounced off the high vaulted ceilings of the courthouse. She lunged forward and grabbed Winston's arm, digging her manicured acrylic nails deep into his expensive suit jacket. Her voice was shrill and completely unhinged as she finally confessed the ugly truth about their hidden financial situation. She admitted right there in the hallway that Spencer had used the pending family trust lawsuit as direct collateral to secure a massive $4 million high-interest bridge loan from a ruthless private equity firm. She sobbed uncontrollably, telling her father that they had already spent hundreds of thousands of dollars paying for her luxury clinic expansion party, her custom designer wardrobe, and their massive suburban mansion. Because the lawsuit was now officially dismissed, the fraudulent loan was completely in default. The private equity firm was legally entitled to seize her aesthetic clinic, her luxury cars, and her home by the end of the week. Jasmine was completely hysterical, screaming that she could not be poor, and she absolutely refused to lose her elite country club status because of Spencer's stupid amateur mistakes. I stood a few feet away, watching my lifelong abusers turn on each other like starving feral animals. Winston yanked his arm out of Jasmine's desperate grip, looking at her with deep, profound disappointment. He aggressively adjusted his silk tie and straightened his posture desperately, trying to regain control of his rapidly crumbling empire. He ordered Jasmine to stop acting like a hysterical child in a federal building. He puffed out his chest, projecting that same terrifying patriarchal authority he had used to control the women in our family for decades. He stated that the Washington family always survives because he built an ironclad legacy that no one could ever destroy. He looked at me with absolute seething contempt and told me to enjoy my little hollow victory because he was about to fix this entire mess with a single phone call. He proudly announced that he would simply call his senior wealth manager and refinance the massive commercial real estate portfolio he owned in downtown Atlanta. He bragged loudly that $4 million was nothing but pocket change to a man of his immense stature, and he would personally write a check to cover the bridge loan by the end of the day. Winston pulled his sleek smartphone from his pocket, right there in the middle of the courthouse hallway. He dialed his private executive banker and proudly put the phone on speaker so we could all hear his undeniable power and unlimited financial influence. The line rang twice before the banker finally answered. Winston's voice boomed with arrogant authority as he demanded an immediate emergency cash withdrawal of $4 million against his commercial properties on Peachtree Street. He ordered the banker to expedite the paperwork and wire the funds directly to Jasmine's accounts within the hour so she could save her pathetic little clinic. The hallway was perfectly quiet as we waited for the banker's obedient, eager response. But the banker did not sound obedient or eager to please at all. His voice trembled through the tiny speaker, sounding completely terrified and breathless. The banker went completely silent for a long, heavy moment before nervously clearing his throat. He stuttered, apologizing profusely to Winston over and over again. He explained that he absolutely could not authorize any cash withdrawals or refinancing on those specific commercial properties. Winston slammed his heavy cane against the marble floor, demanding to know why his own personal bank was refusing his direct financial orders. The banker took a shaky breath and delivered the final fatal blow that would end the Washington family forever. He told Winston that a massive, aggressive corporate entity named Apex Biosolutions had just executed a hostile takeover of all the underlying debt on every single Washington family commercial property. The banker whispered that the entire real estate portfolio was currently locked in a total asset seizure protocol, and Winston officially owned absolutely nothing. The phone slipped right out of Winston's trembling fingers and clattered onto the cold marble floor of the courthouse. I did not stay to watch him struggle to breathe or listen to Jasmine begin to wail all over again. I simply turned on my heel and walked out the heavy glass doors into the bright, warm Atlanta sunshine. I got into the waiting black town car that Richard Harrison had arranged for me and gave the driver the address for the Apex Biosolutions main campus. I leaned my head back against the plush leather seat, closing my eyes and letting out a long, slow breath. For my entire life, Winston had controlled me with the threat of financial ruin. He had used money as a weapon to keep every single person in our family terrified and obedient. He genuinely believed that freezing my meager bank accounts would break my spirit and force me to come crawling back to him on my hands and knees begging for forgiveness. He had absolutely no idea what I had been doing during the week my accounts were frozen. I walked into the massive glass and steel Apex building and rode the private elevator up to my brand new corner office. The room was beautiful with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire downtown skyline. I sat down at my sleek mahogany desk and opened my laptop, looking at the digital files detailing the absolute destruction of the Washington family real estate empire. I had not spent the last 10 days crying or panicking over Spencer's ridiculous ex parte motion. Instead, I had taken all the brilliant analytical skills I used to map complex genetic sequences and applied them directly to Winston's public financial records. I knew my grandfather was a fraud. I knew his supposed billionaire lifestyle was entirely built on a fragile house of cards, consisting of highly leveraged commercial mortgages and predatory bridging loans. While Spencer was busy throwing lavish parties with fake money, I sat down in the Apex boardroom with Richard and his team of ruthless investment bankers. I laid out every single piece of my grandfather's toxic commercial debt. I showed them exactly how overextended the Washington family truly was. I explained that the Washington Empire was entirely built on vanity and ego. Winston had borrowed millions just to fund Jasmine's useless lifestyle brand and Spencer's failing commercial ventures. I explained that Winston owned dozens of valuable properties in prime downtown locations, but he had borrowed against every single one of them at astronomical interest rates, just to maintain his country club facade. I offered the Apex Investment Wing a deal they absolutely could not refuse. I leveraged my massive equity in the new genetic vaccine patent as a guarantee. I convinced the Apex financial team to launch a completely silent, hostile takeover of the entire Washington real estate portfolio. The bankers were incredibly impressed by my ruthless strategy. They ran the numbers and realized I was handing them a goldmine of distressed assets. They deployed their massive capital reserves and swept through the Atlanta financial district like a silent, invisible hurricane. They moved with terrifying corporate efficiency. Over the course of 5 days, they quietly approached every single bank and private lender that held Winston's toxic mortgages. They bought up all his debt, paying pennies on the dollar because the lenders were already terrified of Winston's impending defaults. Apex acquired every single loan, every commercial deed, and every promissory note associated with the Washington name. But Richard did not keep the debt for Apex Biosolutions. That was the most beautiful part of the plan. As part of my signing bonus and partnership agreement, Richard legally transferred the master portfolio of Winston's debt into a brand new private entity. It was a holding company I had registered just 3 days ago using my new corporate resources. I sat in my quiet office looking at the final confirmation emails, knowing that the trap was finally complete. I was no longer the scared little girl hiding in a veterinary clinic. I was a corporate executive with the backing of a global medical empire, and I had just bought my grandfather's entire life. Miles away in the wealthy suburbs of Buckhead, Winston was completely losing his mind. He had abandoned Jasmine and Spencer at the courthouse, refusing to even look at them after the catastrophic deposition. He rode back to his massive, sprawling estate in absolute terrified silence. He marched through his heavy mahogany front doors, ignoring the greeting from his private staff. He went straight into his dark wood-paneled study and began frantically pulling open filing cabinets, desperately searching for hard copies of his commercial property deeds. He was sweating heavily, his heart pounding in his chest as he tried to figure out how a hostile corporate entity had managed to seize his lifework without him even noticing. He picked up his desk phone to yell at his lawyers, but before he could even dial the doorbell, echoed through the massive, quiet house. His butler walked into the study a few moments later, carrying a thick, heavy manila envelope. The butler explained that a federal courier had just dropped it off, and it required Winston's direct signature. Winston snatched the envelope out of the man's hands, his fingers trembling as he tore open the thick paper flap. He pulled out a massive stack of official legal documents printed on heavy watermarked paper. Winston put on his gold-rimmed reading glasses and stared at the front page. It was a formal declaration of debt ownership and a notice of immediate total foreclosure on his entire commercial real estate portfolio. Every single property he owned, from the downtown office buildings to the suburban strip malls, was listed in bold black ink. He scanned down the page, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic as he searched for the name of the massive, ruthless corporate entity that had orchestrated his ruin. He expected to see the name Apex Biosolutions printed at the top of the page. Instead, he saw a brand new corporate entity. The document stated that all of his deeply toxic debt was now officially owned by a private firm named Washington Vanguard Holdings, LLC. Winston furrowed his brow, completely confused by the name. He flipped to the final signature page of the legal notice to find out who was managing this mysterious new holding company. His eyes dropped to the bottom of the page, and his blood ran completely cold. Printed in bold black ink, right on the line, reserved for the supreme managing director and absolute owner of all his debt, was my name. Imani Washington. He dropped the papers onto his desk, realizing with absolute horrifying clarity that the granddaughter he had abused and discarded was now his sole supreme creditor, and she owned every single thing he had ever built. The traditional Washington family Sunday dinner had always been a highly orchestrated theatrical display of wealth and absolute power. For my entire life, I was either excluded from these lavish meals or forced to sit silently at the far end of the table while Winston held court. But this particular Sunday, the atmosphere inside the massive dining room was thick with pure, suffocating terror. The crystal chandelier still sparkled, and the private chef had still prepared an extravagant spread of roasted lamb and truffle potatoes, but nobody was eating. Winston sat at the head of the long mahogany table, looking like a deflated, empty shell. His skin was gray and his hands trembled as he stared blindly at his untouched plate. Spencer was pacing back and forth near the floor-to-ceiling windows, frantically muttering into his cell phone, trying to reach any banker or lawyer who would take his calls. Jasmine sat frozen in her chair, her face puffy and red from crying for 3 days straight. They were trapped in a rapidly collapsing house of cards, desperately trying to figure out how to hide their remaining luxury assets before the bankruptcy courts tore them to pieces. They were so consumed by their own panic that they did not even hear the heavy front doors open. They did not hear the footsteps echoing across the imported marble foyer. I did not bother knocking or asking the trembling housekeeper for permission to enter the house I grew up fearing. I simply walked directly into the formal dining room, completely uninvited and unapologetic. I was wearing a razor-sharp, tailored designer suit that cost more than what my mother used to make in an entire year. I walked with my head held high, my spine perfectly straight, and my heels clicking loudly against the hardwood floor. I was not alone. Flanking me on either side were 2 massive, imposing private process servers, wearing dark suits and carrying thick, heavy legal portfolios. The moment I stepped into the dining room, the entire family froze in absolute stunned silence. Spencer's phone dropped away from his ear as his jaw went completely slack. Winston slowly lifted his heavy head, his bloodshot eyes widening in disbelief as he looked at the granddaughter he had spent a lifetime trying to destroy. Jasmine gasped, grabbing the edge of the dining table, her knuckles turning white. She opened her mouth to scream at me, to demand that I leave her house immediately, but the words died in her throat. She looked at the 2 large men standing silently behind me and realized this was not a social visit. I did not wait for any of them to speak. I took my time, walking slowly and deliberately down the length of the long dining table, savoring the absolute palpable fear radiating from every single person in the room. I stopped right next to Winston's high-backed leather chair. I looked down at the great family patriarch, the man who had always told me I was a worthless charity case who would never amount to anything. He tried to puff out his chest and project authority, but he just looked pathetic and broken. I told Winston that his commercial real estate portfolio was currently being liquidated and completely dismantled by my transition team. I kept my voice perfectly calm and level, never raising it above a conversational tone. I explained that my holding company was already in the process of seizing the deeds to his downtown office buildings, his suburban strip malls, and his private country club memberships. I watched the last remaining shreds of his legendary arrogance evaporate into thin air as he finally understood that his financial empire was gone forever and I was the one holding the keys to his kingdom. Then I turned my attention to Jasmine, my brilliant, beautiful, highly successful aunt, who had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate herself. She was staring up at me with wide, terrified eyes, her breathing shallow and erratic. She looked at the heavy legal folders in the hands of the process servers, and she knew exactly what was coming. I walked slowly around the table until I was standing directly over her right shoulder. I looked down at her plate of perfectly plated roasted lamb and expensive imported vegetables. For years, she had handed me itemized bills for every single drop of food, every piece of clothing, and every basic necessity I had ever consumed in this house, treating my very existence as an unpaid debt. I reached out and took one of the thick, heavy legal folders from the process server standing behind me. I held the heavy stack of official foreclosure notices right over Jasmine's pristine porcelain plate. I looked her dead in the eyes, making sure she could see the absolute, unwavering finality in my expression. I told her that since she liked itemized bills so much, I brought her a few of her own. I let go of the folder and dropped the heavy stack of legal documents right onto her plate. The papers slammed down into her food, splashing dark brown gravy across the white tablecloth and ruining her expensive silk blouse. Jasmine let out a high-pitched shriek and jumped back in her chair, but she could not look away from the bold black letters printed across the top of the pages. I leaned down, resting my hands on the table, getting close enough to see the sheer terror vibrating through her entire body. I clearly and methodically explained exactly what those papers meant. I told her that, because Spencer had used the family trust as collateral for his fraudulent high-interest bridge loan, and because I now owned all of that debt, her entire aesthetic clinic was currently being seized by federal marshals. I detailed how the process servers had already visited her flagship clinic downtown, changing the locks and shutting down operations permanently. I watched her perfectly manicured hands shake violently as she realized she was entirely destitute. I told her she had exactly 48 hours to pack whatever clothes she could carry because the bank was taking back the massive suburban mansion she was currently sitting in. Her perfect, pristine world was dissolving right in front of her eyes, and there was absolutely nothing she could do to stop it. Spencer finally found his voice and tried to step forward, stammering out a weak, pathetic threat about tying me up in endless litigation and filing emergency appeals. He shouted that I was a thief and that he would drag my name through the mud until I surrendered the assets back to the family. One of the process servers immediately stepped in his path, crossing his massive arms and daring Spencer to make a single move. Spencer immediately backed down, cowering like a frightened child. I did not even bother looking at Spencer. I kept my eyes locked on Jasmine, watching the reality of absolute poverty wash over her face. I told them both that there was no legal loophole, no emergency appeal, and no wealthy connection left in Atlanta that could possibly save them from what was coming. I reminded them that the federal government was already preparing a criminal indictment against Spencer for his perjury during the deposition, and that every dollar they tried to hide would be tracked down and seized. They had built their entire lives on stolen money and arrogant lies, and now the bill had finally come due. I turned my back on them, walking slowly toward the front door, while leaving them sitting in the ruins of their shattered dynasty, as the process servers officially recorded the delivery of their absolute financial destruction. I had barely taken 3 steps toward the grand mahogany double doors when a desperate high-pitched wail echoed through the dining room behind me. Before I could even turn around, I felt 2 hands grab the fabric of my suit jacket, pulling me to a sudden stop. It was Yolanda, my mother, the woman who had spent 34 years standing silently in the shadows, while Winston and Jasmine tore my self-esteem to shreds. Now she was throwing herself completely onto the hard wooden floor, landing heavily on her knees right at my feet. The same woman who had happily allowed her husband to cut me off financially and watched her golden child sister mock my clothes in my apartment was now clinging to my legs like a drowning victim. Tears were streaming down Yolanda's perfectly made-up face, ruining her expensive foundation, as she looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. She sobbed uncontrollably, begging me to stop the process servers and reverse the holding company asset seizures. She cried out that we were family, that we shared the same blood, and that I could not possibly be so cruel as to put my own parents out on the cold street. She pleaded with me to remember that she gave birth to me and that family is supposed to forgive each other no matter what mistakes were made. I looked down at the woman kneeling on the floor and I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no sadness, no guilt. The emotional well had run completely dry. I calmly reached down and peeled her trembling fingers off my suit jacket one by one, stepping back so she could not touch me again. My voice was quiet, but it carried through the silent dining room like the sharp crack of a whip. I told Yolanda that she did not care one bit about my blood when she stood by and actively helped this family try to steal my entire life's work. I reminded her that she was perfectly happy to sacrifice her own flesh and blood just to fund a white man's failing law firm and protect Jasmine's fragile fake socialite ego. I looked her dead in the eyes and said, "She made her choice a long time ago. She chose her golden child over me every single day of my life." I told her that since she loved Jasmine so much, she could go pack her bags and live in her daughter's foreclosed clinic. Jasmine let out another loud, agonizing scream from the dining table as the reality of my words truly set in. The clinic was not just losing its lease, it was completely gone. I made sure to outline exactly how systematic and ruthless the Apex Financial Division had been. I explained that because Jasmine had used the physical clinic and all its medical equipment as direct collateral for Spencer's toxic bridge loan, my holding company now legally owned every single laser, every imported waiting room chair, and every drop of Botox in the building. I told her that the federal marshals were not just changing the locks, they were actively seizing the patient databases and freezing the merchant accounts. Jasmine was officially stripped of her elite medical spa status, and she would wake up tomorrow morning with absolutely zero income and a mountain of personal debt she could never repay. Spencer was still cowering near the windows, clutching his dead cell phone with white knuckles. He tried to speak to negotiate some kind of pathetic corporate surrender, but his voice failed him completely. I turned my attention to the brilliant, highly educated lawyer who had thought I was nothing but a naive little girl he could easily intimidate. I took a slow step toward him and watched him shrink back in pure terror. I informed Spencer that the Apex corporate legal team had not just sent him a warning, they had officially submitted his forged deposition internet logs and his sworn perjured testimony directly to the State Bar Association first thing on Friday morning. I told him that the bar investigators had already reviewed the federal documents proving my grant status, and they were actively drafting his permanent disbarment papers. I watched the last spark of hope die in Spencer's eyes as I explained that he was not just losing his law license, he was going to federal prison. The fraud he had committed attempting to extort a federally protected medical patent carried severe mandatory minimum sentences. He had destroyed his entire career, his reputation and his freedom, all because he was too greedy and too arrogant to do basic due diligence on my background. He thought he could steal from a quiet black woman without any consequences, but he had blindly walked into a legal slaughterhouse. Winston remained slumped in his heavy leather chair, completely paralyzed by the sheer scope of the devastation. The great patriarch who had ruled our family with an iron fist and endless threats of financial ruin was now the poorest person in the room. He had leveraged his entire empire, his properties, his homes, his investments, just to maintain an illusion of extreme wealth. And I had systematically bought every single drop of that toxic debt. I owned the house he was sitting in, I owned the cars in his driveway, and I owned the very chair he was slumped in. He had nothing left to threaten me with, nothing left to control anyone with. The mighty Winston Washington was officially a bankrupt, penniless old man who would spend the rest of his short, miserable life trying to dodge creditors and process servers. I did not wait for any of them to speak again. There was nothing left to say. I turned around and walked out of the massive mahogany front doors, leaving them entirely alone with the wreckage they had brought upon themselves. The warm Georgia evening air hit my face as I walked down the long, perfectly manicured driveway toward my waiting car. I stepped into the back seat and told the driver to take me back to the city. I looked out the tinted window as the massive iron gates of the Washington estate closed behind me for the final time. The empire was completely dead, and I was finally entirely free to build my own legacy. The heavy silence in the courthouse hallway was completely suffocating as the banker's terrified words echoed through the speakerphone. Winston stood perfectly still, staring at the device in his trembling hand, as if it had suddenly turned into a venomous snake. The great patriarch who had spent his entire life commanding absolute obedience and projecting unlimited wealth could not comprehend the sheer magnitude of his sudden destruction. He opened his mouth to scream at the banker, to demand an immediate reversal of the asset seizure, but his voice caught in his throat. The phone slipped right out of his fingers and clattered onto the cold marble floor, shattering the screen into a dozen jagged pieces. Jasmine let out a fresh, horrifying wail, realizing that her multi-million-dollar aesthetic clinic, her luxury vehicles, and her massive suburban mansion were all officially gone. Spencer simply slid down the marble wall and sat on the floor, pulling his knees to his chest like a broken child. I did not stay to watch them struggle to breathe. I turned on my heel and walked out the heavy glass doors into the bright, warm Atlanta sunshine. I climbed into the back of the waiting black town car that Richard Harrison had arranged for me and gave the driver the address for the Apex Biosolutions main campus. I leaned my head back against the plush leather seats, closing my eyes and letting out a long, slow breath. For my entire life, Winston had controlled me with the threat of financial ruin. He had used money as a weapon to keep every single person in our family terrified and obedient. He genuinely believed that freezing my meager bank accounts would break my spirit and force me to come crawling back to him on my hands and knees begging for forgiveness. He had absolutely no idea what I had been doing during the week my accounts were frozen. I walked into the massive glass and steel Apex building and rode the private elevator up to my brand new corner office. The room was beautiful, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire downtown skyline. I sat down at my sleek mahogany desk and opened my laptop, looking at the digital files detailing the absolute destruction of the Washington family real estate empire. I had not spent the last 10 days crying or panicking over Spencer's ridiculous motion. Instead, I had taken all the brilliant analytical skills I used to map complex genetic sequences and applied them directly to Winston's public financial records. I knew my grandfather was a fraud. I knew his supposed billionaire lifestyle was entirely built on a fragile house of cards consisting of highly leveraged commercial mortgages and predatory bridging loans. While Spencer was busy throwing lavish parties with fake money, I sat down in the Apex boardroom with Richard and his team of ruthless investment bankers. I laid out every single piece of my grandfather's toxic commercial debt. I showed them exactly how overextended the Washington family truly was. I explained that the Washington Empire was entirely built on vanity and ego. Winston had borrowed millions just to fund Jasmine's useless lifestyle brand and Spencer's failing commercial ventures. I offered the Apex investment wing a deal they absolutely could not refuse. I leveraged my massive equity in the new genetic vaccine patent as a guarantee. I convinced the Apex financial team to launch a completely silent, hostile takeover of the entire Washington real estate portfolio. The bankers were incredibly impressed by my ruthless strategy. They ran the numbers and realized I was handing them a goldmine of distressed assets. They deployed their massive capital reserves and swept through the Atlanta financial district like a silent, invisible hurricane. They moved with terrifying corporate efficiency. Over the course of 5 days, they quietly approached every single bank and private lender that held Winston's toxic mortgages. They bought up all his debt, paying pennies on the dollar because the lenders were already terrified of Winston's impending defaults. Apex acquired every single loan, every commercial deed, and every promissory note associated with the Washington name. But Richard did not keep the debt for Apex Biosolutions. That was the most beautiful part of the plan. As part of my signing bonus and partnership agreement, Richard legally transferred the master portfolio of Winston's debt into a brand new private entity. It was a holding company I had registered just 3 days ago using my new corporate resources. I sat in my quiet office looking at the final confirmation emails, knowing that the trap was finally complete. I was no longer the scared little girl hiding in a veterinary clinic. I was a corporate executive with the backing of a global medical empire, and I had just bought my grandfather's entire life. By the time Sunday rolled around, the atmosphere inside the massive Buckhead estate was thick with pure suffocating terror. I knew exactly what was happening inside that house, because I knew their routines perfectly. The traditional Washington family Sunday dinner had always been a highly orchestrated theatrical display of wealth and absolute power. For my entire life, I was either excluded from these lavish meals or forced to sit silently at the far end of the table while Winston held court. But this particular Sunday, I knew the crystal chandeliers were sparkling over a table of people who were completely paralyzed by panic. They were desperately trying to figure out how to avoid bankruptcy and hide their remaining luxury assets before the courts tore them to pieces. I pulled up to the massive iron gates in my town car, flanked by two massive, imposing private process servers, wearing dark suits and carrying thick, heavy legal portfolios. The gate guard did not even try to stop me. He took one look at the federal paperwork my servers held up and immediately buzzed us onto the property. I did not bother knocking or asking the trembling housekeeper for permission to enter the house I grew up fearing. I simply walked directly into the formal dining room, completely uninvited and unapologetic. I was wearing a razor-sharp tailored designer suit that cost more than what my mother used to make in an entire year. The moment I stepped into the dining room, the entire family froze in absolute stunned silence. Winston sat at the head of the long mahogany table, looking like a deflated empty shell, his skin gray and his hands trembling. Spencer dropped his phone away from his ear, his jaw going completely slack. Jasmine gasped, grabbing the edge of the dining table, her knuckles turning white. She opened her mouth to scream at me, to demand that I leave her house immediately, but the words died in her throat as she looked at the two large men standing silently behind me. I did not wait for any of them to speak. I walked slowly and deliberately down the length of the long dining table, stopping right next to Jasmine. I looked down at her plate of perfectly plated roasted lamb and expensive imported vegetables. For years, she had handed me itemized bills for every single drop of food, every piece of clothing, and every basic necessity I had ever consumed in this house, treating my very existence as an unpaid debt. I reached out and took one of the thick, heavy legal folders from the process server standing behind me. I held the heavy stack of official foreclosure notices right over Jasmine's pristine porcelain plate. I looked her dead in the eyes, making sure she could see the absolute, unwavering finality in my expression. I told her that since she liked itemized bills so much, I brought her a few of her own. I let go of the folder and dropped the heavy stack of legal documents right onto her plate. The papers slammed down into her food, splashing dark brown gravy across the white tablecloth and ruining her expensive silk blouse. I leaned down and clearly explained that my personal holding company was now her supreme creditor, and I was officially seizing her clinic, her cars, and this entire mansion. Jasmine let out a high-pitched shriek as the reality set in. Yolanda threw herself onto the hard wooden floor, landing heavily on her knees right at my feet, crying out that we were family and shared the same blood. She begged me not to put my own parents out on the cold street. I calmly peeled her trembling fingers off my suit jacket and told her she did not care about my blood when she tried to steal my life's work to fund a failing law firm. I told her she chose her golden child, and now she could go live in her foreclosed clinic. Winston tried to summon his old rage, pointing a trembling finger at my face and spitting out that I would die entirely alone with my money. I stared directly into his hollow eyes and replied that it was far better to be alone and rich than to be surrounded by weak, pathetic parasites. I turned my back on the great Winston Washington and signaled the process servers to clear the property, leaving them alone in the ruins of their shattered dynasty. Exactly 12 months had passed since I walked down that long driveway and left the Washington family to rot in the absolute destruction of their own making. The warm spring sun beat down on my shoulders as I stood on the lush green campus of the oldest historically black university in the South. I was no longer the terrified girl hiding in a suburban veterinary clinic or the angry granddaughter seeking vengeance. I was simply Imani, and I was completely at peace. I looked up at the massive glass and steel building towering in front of me. The bold metallic letters across the front entrance spelled out the new Advanced Agricultural and Genetic Research Laboratory. I had fully funded the entire state-of-the-art facility with a $10 million direct grant from my personal holdings. It was a place designed to push the boundaries of modern science and provide opportunities for students who grew up just like I did. All around me, the main courtyard was packed with hundreds of brilliant young students, dedicated professors, and respected scientists from across the globe. They were talking and laughing, holding their notebooks, and waiting for the official ribbon-cutting ceremony to begin. There were no fake smiles here, and there was no toxic underlying agenda masking deep family resentment. These were people who genuinely cared about changing the world, and they respected me purely for my intellect and my contributions to the scientific community. I took a deep breath of the sweet spring air, letting the sheer joy of the moment wash over my entire body. I had spent my entire childhood being told that my passion for science was a useless hobby, and that my refusal to join the corrupt family real estate business was a massive, pathetic failure. Now I was standing in front of a facility that would train the next generation of brilliant geneticists and agricultural engineers. The transition from being a victim to being a supreme architect of my own destiny had been incredible. Over the past year, I had worked closely with Richard Harrison and the Apex Biosolutions Board to finalize the global rollout of the agricultural vaccine I had engineered. The success of that single patent had generated more wealth than Winston could have ever dreamed of accumulating in 10 lifetimes. But instead of hoarding the money to buy empty mansions and useless sports cars, I poured it directly into education and real scientific advancement. I wanted to make sure that no young, brilliant mind was ever forced to endure the kind of financial abuse I had suffered just to get a degree. As the university president stepped up to the microphone to begin the welcoming remarks, I felt my phone buzz quietly in the pocket of my tailored blazer. I pulled it out and glanced down at the bright screen. It was a brief email update from my lead corporate attorney, who always liked to keep me informed about the loose ends we had left behind in Atlanta. I scrolled through the short message, and a quiet, genuine smile spread across my face. Spencer had finally reached the absolute bottom of his miserable downward spiral. The State Bar Association had officially stripped him of his license to practice law, permanently disbarring him for perjury and massive financial fraud. He was currently working a minimum wage job doing basic data entry for a sketchy collections agency, just trying to pay off his endless mounting legal penalties. He was living in a cheap motel and taking the bus to work every single day. The update on Jasmine was even more poetic and satisfying. Without Winston's stolen money to fund her lavish lifestyle brand, and without her luxurious aesthetic clinic to prop up her massive fragile ego, she had been forced to face brutal reality. She was now working grueling 14-hour night shifts as a standard floor nurse in a chronically underfunded public hospital. The woman who used to hand me itemized bills for basic groceries and mock my cheap clothing was now drowning under a mountain of crushing debt that she would spend the rest of her miserable life trying to escape. She spent her days emptying bedpans, changing dirty bandages, and answering call buttons for minimum pay, completely stripped of the glamour and prestige she cared about more than her own family. And Winston, the great terrifying patriarch, was living out his final days in a cramped one-bedroom apartment entirely alone and completely forgotten by the high society he had tried so desperately to impress. I locked my phone screen and slid the device back into my pocket, letting the past disappear completely. I did not feel any lingering anger or bitterness toward any of them. The hatred that used to burn inside my chest had entirely burned itself out. They simply did not matter to me anymore. I looked out at the crowd of bright, eager students watching their faces light up with pure anticipation, and I felt a profound sense of absolute belonging. I had not just dismantled a corrupt empire, I had built my own chosen family and my own lasting positive legacy. The university president called my name, and the entire courtyard erupted into genuine enthusiastic applause. The sound echoed off the brick buildings and rolled across the campus like a wave of pure validation. I walked up the short flight of stairs to the wooden podium, looking out at the sea of smiling faces looking back at me. I thought about how my mother had always called me a massive disappointment and how Winston had labeled my education a total waste of a degree. I realized now, standing in the sunlight, that the very education they had relentlessly mocked had been the most dangerous and powerful weapon I could have ever wielded. I reached out and adjusted the microphone, ready to welcome the students to their brand new laboratory, knowing with absolute certainty that I had finally won. The greatest lesson from Imani's journey is that true power does not come from waiting for toxic people to validate your worth. When your own blood tries to destroy you, your best revenge is building an empire they cannot touch. She proved that the very talents they mocked can become the tools of their destruction and your ultimate liberation. You do not owe loyalty to those who only view you as a resource. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your own future? Share your story in the comments below and subscribe for more videos.